Something was pulled out of the ground in Oregon that has left some of the most respected scientists in the world completely silent. Not confused, not debating, silent. Because what they found does not fit into any timeline, any textbook, or any explanation that modern archaeology has ever offered. And the moment word got out, the pressure to suppress it began almost immediately. But the evidence is already out there. And once you hear what was discovered, you will never look at human history the same way again. For decades, the official story of a human settlement in North America has been locked in place like concrete. The mainstream narrative told us that the first humans crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska roughly 13 to 15,000 years ago. They moved south, they spread out, they built civilizations. That was the story. Neat, organized, comfortable. But archaeology has never been a comfortable science because the Earth has a way of exposing what we think we know and burning it to the ground. And what just came out of Oregon is doing exactly that. The location is a place called the Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, sitting in the high desert of eastern Oregon near the town of Riley. It is not a glamorous sight. There are no towering ruins, no golden artifacts, no dramatic canyon walls carved with ancient art. It is a modest rock overhang in a flat, dry landscape that most people drive past without a second thought. But underneath that unremarkable surface, buried beneath layers of volcanic ash, compacted sediment, and thousands of years of geological pressure, researchers from the Bureau of Land Management and a team of archaeologists began uncovering something that would rewrite everything. The excavation at Rimrock Draw had been ongoing for years. Archaeologists had been carefully brushing away layers of soil, cataloging fragments of bone and stone with painstaking precision. And then they found it. Beneath a layer of volcanic ash, definitively dated to approximately 15,800 years ago, they uncovered stone tools. Not pebbles that vaguely resembled tools, actual deliberately shaped stone tools. Bifacial tools with intentional flaking patterns that could only have been created by human hands with intelligence, intention, and skill. Tools that required knowledge. Tools that required planning. Here is why that single detail changes everything. If those tools were found beneath ash that is 15,800 years old, then those tools were placed there before that ash fell. Which means human beings were standing in Oregon before that volcanic eruption happened. And the accepted date for humans even arriving in North America from the Siberian land bridge is 13 to 15,000 years ago. The math does not work. The timeline collapses. Someone was already here, already making sophisticated tools, already living and surviving in the Pacific Northwest before the people who were supposed to be the first Americans even made the crossing. But the discovery does not stop there, because buried alongside those stone tools were something else entirely. Animal bones. And not just any animal bones. The bones belonged to a camel. Now, before you picture the kind of camel you might see in a desert in the Middle East, understand that ancient North America was home to its own species of camel. The western camel, known as Camelops hesternus, roamed the grasslands and high deserts of North America for millions of years. These were massive animals, larger than their modern relatives, built for the harsh terrain of Pleistocene North America. And they went extinct. The accepted date for the extinction of these ancient camels is approximately 13,000 years ago. Some estimates push that to around 15,000 years ago at the outer edge. So here is what the evidence at Rimrock Draw is telling us. Human beings were in Oregon with sophisticated stone tools, interacting with, or at minimum sharing territory with, an animal species that was supposed to go extinct around the same time the first humans were supposedly just arriving in North America. The layers of impossibility stack on top of each other. Either humans arrived far earlier than anyone officially admits, or the extinction timeline of these ancient animals needs to be completely recalibrated, or both. Either conclusion destroys the established narrative. The team that made this discovery did not rush to the press. They did not hold a dramatic news conference. They spent years, literally years, re-examining the evidence, running additional tests, consulting with geologists, volcanologists, and dating specialists to make absolutely certain they were not making an error. The volcanic ash layer was tested and retested. The tools were examined by multiple independent experts. The stratigraphic context, meaning the exact position of the artifacts within the layers of Earth, was documented with obsessive care, because they knew what they were sitting on. They knew the reaction this would cause, and they wanted their science to be bulletproof before they said a word. When the findings were finally published, the archaeology world did not celebrate. It fractured. Some researchers accepted the implications immediately, recognizing that evidence had been building for years that the Clovis first theory, the idea that the Clovis people were the first humans in the Americas, was already crumbling. Sites in Chile and Texas and Florida had already been pushing back the human presence in the Americas earlier and earlier. Rimrock Draw was not an isolated anomaly. It was confirmation of a pattern that had been quietly emerging for decades, but other researchers pushed back hard. The tools could be naturally occurring fractures in the stone, some argued. The stratigraphy could have been disturbed by geological activity. There could be contamination in the dating samples. Every possible alternative explanation was thrown at the discovery with the force of institutional protection. Because if rimrock draw is legitimate, and the evidence strongly suggests that it is, then generations of academic careers built on the Clovis first model are standing on sand. What makes the resistance particularly fascinating is that this is not the first time the archaeological establishment has fought tooth and nail against evidence of early human presence in the Americas. The story of the Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania is a perfect parallel. In the 1970s, archaeologist James Adovazio uncovered artifacts at Meadowcroft dated to as far back as 16,000 years ago, potentially even earlier. The response from mainstream archaeology was immediate and aggressive. The dates were challenged, the methods were questioned, and Adovazio spent decades defending findings that have since been largely validated. The pattern repeats itself. The establishment resists, the evidence persists, and eventually the truth wins. Monteverde in southern Chile is another example that should have permanently shattered the Clovis first model years ago. The site, excavated by Tom Dillahay, contained evidence of human habitation dating to at least 14,600 years ago, and potentially as far back as 33,000 years ago, in deeper layers. To reach southern Chile, humans would have had to pass through North America first. So if people were in southern Chile that early, when exactly did they arrive in North America? The dates demanded at least 18,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. Yet the resistance from mainstream archaeology was fierce and sustained. Monteverde is now broadly accepted. The lesson about institutional resistance to revolutionary evidence was apparently not fully learned. Now back in eastern Oregon, the implications of rimrock draw continue to ripple outward. Because the question that immediately follows the discovery is not just when were humans here, but who were they? The Clovis people, long considered the first Americans, are associated with a very specific and identifiable tool technology, the Clovis point, a distinctive fluted stone spearhead found across North America. The tools found at rimrock draw are not Clovis tools. They predate Clovis technology, which means the people who made them were not the Clovis people. They were someone else entirely, a population that arrived in North America through an unknown route at an unknown time, carrying their own distinct technological tradition that has no clear origin story in the current historical record. This is where human history does not just get pushed back by a few thousand years, it gets fundamentally complicated. Because if there was a population of humans in Oregon making sophisticated bifacial stone tools more than 15,800 years ago, they did not appear out of nowhere. They came from somewhere. They had ancestors, they had a migration route, they had a history that predates anything we have mapped. Who were these people? Where did they come from? And what happened to them? Some researchers have begun pointing to genetic evidence that has been quietly accumulating alongside the archaeological discoveries. DNA studies of indigenous populations across the Americas have revealed puzzling anomalies for years. Some Native American populations carry genetic markers that do not match the expected profile of descendants from a single Siberian migration event. Certain groups in the Amazon, in Baja California, and in other isolated pockets carry genetic signatures that appear more closely related to populations from Southeast Asia, from Australia, and from Melanesia than from Siberia. This has been called the population Y signal by geneticists, a ghost population whose origin and migration route remain deeply contested. The genetic data and the archaeological data are now beginning to whisper the same thing. North America may have been reached by multiple waves of migration, by different populations, traveling different routes at different times, stretching back potentially tens of thousands of years further than anyone has officially accepted. The picture of a single group crossing a single land bridge at a single moment in time is almost certainly too simple. Reality, as it almost always does, turns out to be vastly more complex. There is also the question of what these early Oregonians were doing. The stone tools found at rimrock draw suggest a highly adaptive, skilled population. Bifacial tools require significant cognitive ability and technical knowledge to produce. The toolmaker must understand the fracture properties of different stone types, must be able to plan multiple steps ahead, and must have the fine motor control and patience to execute precise strikes at precise angles. This is not primitive survival behavior. This is sophisticated technology. Now, these were not struggling wanderers barely clinging to existence in an unfamiliar landscape. These were skilled people who knew what they were doing in a land they apparently knew well. The presence of the ancient camel bones alongside the tools adds another layer. Whether those bones represent a hunting event, a scavenging event, or simply co-location in the same sediment layer is still debated. But the proximity suggests at minimum that these early humans were sharing a landscape with megafauna that we believed disappeared before humans were even supposed to be on this continent. And that raises another enormous question that archaeologists have argued about for generations. Did humans cause the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna of North America? The mammoths, the mastodons, the giant ground sloths, the saber-toothed cats, the American horses, the camels? The overkill hypothesis suggests that human hunters arriving in the Americas encountered animals that had no fear of humans and were hunted to extinction in a relatively short period. But if humans were in North America far earlier than we thought, the extinction timeline shifts. The relationship between early humans and ancient megafauna becomes far more complex, far more ambiguous, and far more interesting. It is also worth noting what is happening in Oregon beyond Rimrock Draw. The state has quietly become one of the most significant locations in the ongoing rewriting of American prehistory. The Paisley Caves, located not far from Rimrock Draw in the same high desert region of eastern Oregon, have yielded human coprolites, fossilized human feces, dated to approximately 14,300 years ago. These were tested using ancient DNA analysis and confirmed to be human, and critically, the genetic signature from those coprolites does not match the expected Clovis profile. Oregon is turning into a window into a past that keeps getting older and stranger and more resistant to the tidy explanations we have been taught to accept. What is happening at these Oregon sites also forces a rethinking of the routes by which humans reached the Americas in the first place. The traditional model invokes the Bering Land Bridge, a massive expanse of land connecting modern Siberia to modern Alaska that was exposed during periods of lowered sea level during the last ice age. Humans crossed this bridge and then made their way south, either through a corridor that opened between massive ice sheets as the glaciers retreated, or along the Pacific coast in small watercraft, hugging the shoreline southward. These are the two dominant competing routes, and both are still actively debated. But what if neither route accounts for all of the migrations? What if some populations reach the Americas by open ocean voyaging across the Pacific? It sounds extraordinary. But the genetic evidence pointing to connections between some Native American groups and populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania is not easy to dismiss. And experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that ancient peoples were far more capable of open ocean navigation than we once assumed. The Polynesian expansion across the Pacific, reaching islands thousands of miles apart using only stars, waves, and traditional navigation knowledge, is one of the most astonishing feats of human exploration in history. If Polynesian sailors could colonize the remote islands of the Pacific, why not a crossing in the opposite direction, or an earlier migration by ancestral populations following similar routes? The implications of that possibility are staggering. It would mean that the human story in the Americas is not a story of one people and one journey. It is a story of multiple peoples, multiple journeys, multiple chapters stretching back further into the deep past than our current tools have fully mapped. And here is the thing that the silence of the scientists at Rimrock Draw ultimately reveals. It is not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of people standing at the edge of something vast, something they can sense is real but cannot yet fully see. Real science has always looked like this at its most important moments. The moment before the accepted model breaks open is always uncomfortable, always contested, always charged with the kind of tension that makes institutions defensive and individuals bold. The discovery at Rimrock Draw is not a fringe claim. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is peer-reviewed, carefully documented, multiply-verified archaeological evidence sitting in the public record, waiting for the wider world to fully reckon with what it means. The tools are real. The ash layer is real. The dates are real. And the story they tell of human beings standing in the high desert of Oregon in a time when they were not supposed to exist on this continent is real. What this means for the indigenous peoples of the Americas is profound and layered. Many Native American oral traditions have always maintained that their ancestors did not come from somewhere else, that they have always been here. Archaeology has often dismissed these traditions as mythology, but the evidence accumulating at sites like Rimrock Draw, Meadowcroft, Monteverde, and the Paisley Caves is increasingly aligning with the core claim embedded in those traditions. The people were here. They were here long before the official record acknowledged them. Their history is deeper, older, and richer than the textbooks ever admitted. The ground in Oregon is still being excavated. Every field season brings the possibility of another layer, another artifact, another date that pushes the story further back. And scientists are watching, waiting, and in many cases still silent. Not because they have nothing to say, but because what they are looking at is so far beyond what they were trained to expect that finding the right words for it is genuinely difficult. What was found in the desert near Riley, Oregon, is not just an archaeological discovery. It is a door swinging open on a part of human history that has been locked for a very long time. And now that door is open, the question is not whether the story changes. The question is how much of what we thought we knew will survive what comes next. Because if the past has taught us anything, it is that the Earth keeps its secrets patiently, releases them on its own schedule, and cares nothing at all for the timelines we have built around our own comfort. The silence of scientists is not the end of this story, it is the beginning.